When the Sandinistas came to power in Nicaragua 10 years ago, filled with ideals and hopes for their nation and their people, they discovered a very awful thing. And it wasn't about themselves, even though they had to do it to themselves. It was about that capitalist encirclement. They discovered that they needed a secret police. They discovered that they needed a security police. Because all around them, coming in from two borders and within their own society, were acts of sabotage, espionage, attack, mercenary invasion, and the like. And they understood that if the revolution was going to survive, it would have to build up instruments of state power, instruments of coercion even. And these instruments, by the way, can make mistakes. And these instruments can not only make mistakes, they can commit some serious crimes. Although in Nicaragua, the impressive record is how few crimes there were, given the utterly dire conditions they were under. That capitalist encirclement, which goes on, unrelenting, attacking any existing socialist, communist, if you don't want to call, by the way, if some of you don't want to call those societies socialist, if you don't want to call that socialist, that's not what real socialism is. Something that's going to exist someday when the world and people are better and different, and it's going to come down and be in a much better form than those things were. That's fine. But in this world, see, I believe socialism is not that real, beautiful goal in that society, participation, harmony, this and that. I believe that socialism is a process of struggle to achieve that thing. So, those socialist or communist societies suffered terrible distorting effects. If there had been no invasion, if there had been no espionage, if there had been no attack, if there had been no white guard armies burning villages, there wouldn't have been a red army of that size. There wouldn't have been a Stalin, there wouldn't have been a KGB. If there hadn't been a CIA, there wouldn't have been a KGB. If there hadn't been a NATO encirclement, there wouldn't have been a Warsaw Pact.
Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism, the show where we get to hear from people who live in a socialist country, have lived in a socialist country, or have studied them extensively. This is your host, Tony, and what you just heard is a clip from the great Michael Parenti. In this episode, I'm joined by the incredibly educational Gabriel Rockhill to talk about a controversial concept for Western socialists, the idea of siege socialism. And unlike most episodes of the show, we won't be focusing on a specific country, but examining the variety of past and present socialist countries through the lens of historical materialism and dialectics, two concepts Gabriel masterfully explains for us. Gabriel Rockhill is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, a professor of philosophy at Villanova University, and the author or editor of over 9 books, as well as numerous scholarly and general public articles. He can be found on social media at Gabriel Rockhill. Info about all of this, his excellent website, YouTube channel, an interview he did recently with Monthly Review can all be found in the show notes. Over the years, I've learned so much from his work, so I highly recommend that you all check that out after listening to this episode. Gabriel is also the editor of the upcoming translation of Domenico Losurdo's magisterial Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, and How It Could Be Reborn. If you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that we highly appreciate Losurdo's work. This book will be coming out August 1st, so information on how to pre-order/order, depending on when you're listening to this, can be found in the show notes too. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/AES the podcast, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus content. For example, if you were to subscribe now, you would gain access to an additional conversation I had with Gabriel, where we talk about siege socialism in the 21st century. You'll also get access to things such as Notes for Comrades, which features a transcript of the episode, study questions, detailed notes, and further resources, as well as access to a growing collection of vintage documentaries about socialist countries. I'd like to take a second here to shout out to my most recent Patreon subscribers since the last episode. Their names are Aberkay, Brielle, Ben, and Sean Atkinson. I literally could not do this without your support. If you're unable to contribute in this way, not a problem. You can help out this show by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AES the podcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Please feel free to leave a review, even if it's just a star rating, as this really boosts the algorithm in my favor. I recommend checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance. And as always, you can really help out the show by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. Enjoy the episode. I am very glad to welcome to the show Gabriel Rockhill. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So I've actually been wanting to have you on this show for a while. This show itself isn't generally or regularly a theory podcast. It focuses more on history, sociology, anthropology, personal experiences in regard to socialist countries. But today we're going to be taking a wider view on socialist countries and the experience of socialist countries in the 20th century. Gabriel's done a ton of amazing work on this, but we're only going to be looking at a very specific kind of focus in regards to siege socialism. And what I appreciate about your work is that, as I mentioned, history, sociology, anthropology, we talk about all of that in other episodes, but we're going to be looking at it through the lens you use, which is a materialist analysis of the social totality, which focuses on intertwining and intersections of all of these things. In understanding siege socialism, to kind of lay the groundwork for our discussion, could you explain, these are essentially core Marxist concepts of, on one hand, historical materialism, and then dialectics?
I mean, the briefest, I think, definition of historical materialism is that it is the Marxist science of social life and of its history. There's a quote from Engels where he elucidates what this means. And if we unpack it a little bit, I think we can see more clearly what historical materialism is and how it functions. This is from his 1892 Introduction to Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. He says that historical materialism designates that view of the course of history which seeks the ultimate cause and the great moving power of all important historic events in the economic development of society, in the changes in the modes of production and exchange, in the consequent division of society into distinct classes, and in the struggle of these classes against one another, end quote. So there's a lot to this quote, but there are a few elements I'd like to highlight. One is that historical materialism should not be confused with either empiricism or idealism. Empiricism is based on the assumption that there are brute facts that exist in the world that we can simply capture and kind of correctly reproduce. It's what Marx and Engels criticized as simply the collection of dead facts, right? Unmoored from human experience, from class struggle and things like this. Idealism, of course, they reject because it is the reduction of what they call an imagined reality or an imagined activity of imagined subjects. Idealism presumes that the truth of existence lays in the mind or in spiritual forces that are behind the mind, if it be God or other metaphysical forces. And what's important about this for understanding historical materialism is that hopefully, I know this is a little bit of a philosophic start to our conversation, but that your listeners can see that empiricism begins with the outside world, idealism begins with the human mind or with spiritual forces, and historical materialism says this is a false starting point because there's not a material world out there that we can have access to, at least, absolutely independently of human society, human culture. And the world is certainly not just driven by human thoughts and the human mind. Therefore, what we need is a deeper understanding of how human beings themselves are beings who have emerged out of the natural world, out of the material world. So they're historically constituted beings who strive to understand the world in which they've emerged. And in understanding that world, they also act on that world. Right? So it's a very different worldview, if you will, than a very standard philosophic position that divides the world between mind and world or idea and empirical reality. Another aspect of this that I think is particularly important is that historical materialism is a science and it lays claim to being scientific, but it's not a science in a kind of reductivist, positivistic, and objectivist sense of that term. Science for Marx and Engels is a collective process of attempting to establish the most coherent and systematic elucidation of reality that is always open to revision. So they are what you would call fallibilists, right? They recognize that our truths are provisory and they can be revised based on new incoming information. So what that means is that historical materialism is, on the one hand, a materialist account of history and of human society, but it's also a historically evolving framework of explanation. There's not just a blueprint, if you will, of all of society. The process of Marxist science is a process of ongoing elucidation and the analysis of new and changing historical conjunctures. Maybe just the last thing I'd say on this is that it's very important for Marx and Engels that historical materialism does not exclude human agency. right? So the idea that we would elucidate the functions of the world and our situations within it does not mean that we are simply trying to understand the world. Ultimately, we're trying to transform it. And that transformative element is baked into historical materialism. It's not just a science of elucidation, it's a science of liberation. And it's a revolutionary theory, of course. Does that suffice on historical materialism, or do you want to unpack that more before I go to dialectics?
No, I thought that was an excellent, very brief summary of explaining that concept. Yeah, if we could move on to dialectics, that'd be great. Yeah, because previously on the show, I think I did an episode, it's been a while now, that we actually focused on historical materialism, so I think this was sufficient.
So dialectics it's a worldview, and it consists in recognizing that nature is not static, and nature is not composed of discrete elements that are absolutely separate, but rather that nature is in motion, it's interconnected in a relational totality. And that relational totality is animated by contradictory forces. Engels, I think, is very helpful on this front because he juxtaposed what he called metaphysicians to dialecticians. Metaphysicians are those who approach the world based on the assumption that there are fixed intellectual or spiritual categories or entities that are operative in the world, like the human soul or God or the nature of a particular entity. To the metaphysician, Engels writes, things and their mental reflexes, ideas are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation, fixed, rigid, given once for all. End quote. This is in Anti-Düring, the book Anti-Düring by Engels. Dialectics, by contrast, and this is another quote, comprehends things and their representations, ideas in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending, end quote. Right? So dialectics recognizes the kind of radical historicity to the world. Everything is in time. Everything is changing. It's just that these changes take place at different scales and to different degrees. What this means then is, from a dialectical vantage point, our concepts that we use are limited categories that don't allow us to apprehend the full complexity of the processes that animate the world. So dialectics itself is also an attempt to overcome our own conceptual limitations and open our thought up to the infinitely complex processes that animate the world. Lenin made an enormous contribution to this in claiming, quote, dialectics as living many-sided knowledge, with the number of sides eternally increasing, with an infinite number of shades of every approach and approximation to reality, with a philosophic system growing into a whole out of each shade, right? So he's describing dialectics as this attempt to endlessly complexify the forms of knowledge that we have in order to get closer and closer to a reality that's infinitely complex and in motion. And it's for this reason that if you take a dialectical vantage point, you recognize that human knowledge is ultimately incapable of establishing a definitive and closed system of knowledge, if it be about the natural world or about human society. And Engels says this very explicitly in Anti-Düring, right? So the idea that you sometimes get on the Western left, or as well within conservative communities, that Marx thought he could predict history, or that there were these laws that were supposed to absolutely determine everything that exists in nature or in history, that is a kind of undialectical approach. And maybe I can just give you one example that's much more banal. I realize again that we're starting with these large concepts of the power of dialectics and why dialectical thinking is helpful. There's a famous paradox that people often discuss, and there are different versions of this in philosophy, and it's called the ship of Theseus paradox. It's very simple. It consists in saying, well, Theseus has a ship, and the ship over time wears out, and parts of the ship need to be replaced. And the question is, well, at what point in replacing the parts of the ship does the ship actually become a different ship? Is it no longer the ship of Theseus? Is it when 50% of the parts have been replaced, or all of the parts have been replaced? And one of the reasons that this paradox is generated is because people think like what Engels calls metaphysicians. They assume that there's a strict identity to the ship of Theseus, and that identity would then have its correlate in the external world and could be defined in a rigorous manner in relationship to that correlate. Dialectics says, no, we can solve this paradox very easily. The paradox is generated out of the fact that we have a fixed category of identity, the ship of Theseus, and we're trying to map it onto a complex set of processes that are interrelated that surpass their reduction to that category. So there's not actually a paradox. There's simply a relationship between our limited cognitive categories and the processes and relational nature of the world. And dialectics allows us to overcome that paradox by recognizing that this is just a concept. It doesn't actually apprehend the nature of the world. And I think this will be important for the rest of our conversation, because one of the problems that I see on the Western left is the idea that socialism or communism is this fixed and absolute thing that has a set of predefined aspects to it. And it's not recognized the extent to which it's actually a process, and a process that develops in relationship to the system out of which it grows, and that is capitalism.
I think what you just did there was quite a lot of damage to the history that most of us are presented when it comes to our schooling, whether that's even in the undergraduate level as well, in regards to history being presented as being pretty much almost strictly idealist in terms of its ideas that people have that move history. It's because the founding fathers of the U.S. believed in liberty that they undertook their revolution or something of that sort. On the other hand, also in terms of dialectics, addressing the complexity, the almost endless complexity of concepts, of things, of reality, when that generally just gets flattened into like the most simplest concept possible when we learn history in school.
Well, what we learn in school is bourgeois history, right? It's the history that the capitalist ruling class has set up institutions to indoctrinate us into. And so it also makes sense from a historical materialist vantage point, right? So that's the real power, is historical materialism can not only elucidate the truth of the world, but it can also then unearth the objective forces that have produced the falsities of this world, like bourgeois history.
There's a concept of contradictions that gets used quite often by socialist Marxists. Could you explain what that means in terms of the concepts you just explained?
Contradiction is the basic idea is that there are forces in the world that appear to be incompatible and that enter into thus a contradiction. And those contradictions can be at different levels because people will distinguish between primary, secondary contradictions, etc. And so at one level, those contradictions are just intense conflicts between opposing forces. But one of the things that dialectics allows us to elucidate is that those contradictions between opposing forces, when they enter into a kind of form of antagonism, are actually part of a process. And that process can lead in certain instances to a resolution of that contradiction. Right. So the clearest instance would be in class struggle between something like the capitalist ruling class and the working class, in which these would be two, it's an antagonistic contradiction because their interests do not align at a material level. But this is a process of ongoing class struggle. And that contradiction is ultimately driving to an overcoming of that contradiction. But that overcoming doesn't consist simply in repeating that contradiction at a higher level. So you'd have the proletariat that would be the new ruling class and the bourgeoisie would be the underclass. It's about actually dissolving the conditions of possibility of class antagonism, hence private property, right, as the very basis for that. And so in that regard, contradictions can't simply be understood as kind of oppositions or they really have this logic of a tension that is driving in a process towards a potential overcoming of that tension by a kind of qualitative shift, if you will. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. So you've given us a very good explanations of historical materialism, dialectics, and even now just contradictions and how that fits in. Could you get into kind of like the main focus of our discussion, understanding siege socialism? I'm sure it's a term that I think generally the listeners will be familiar with, but could you explain what are its defining characteristics and what are its specific conditions?
Well, siege socialism is a term that the great Michael Parenti used, and I know others have adopted it as well. It is identifying the fact that socialism in the real world as a state building project has never existed outside of imperialist siege, right? So the idea that you would have a pure socialist project that would be allowed to develop on its own is a mythological construct that has nothing to do with a historical materialist analysis of the actual extant situation. And there's a great quote that I might, if it's okay, I'll just read by William Bloom, whose book Killing Hope is fantastic. And I think he really elucidates this because the whole book is about the imperialist siege on the attempt to build socialism. He says, the boys of capital, they also chortle in their martinis about the death of socialism. The word has been banned from polite conversation, and they hope that no one will notice that every socialist experiment of any significance in the 20th century, and we can say also in the 21st century, without exception, has either been crushed, overthrown, or invaded, or corrupted, perverted, subverted, or destabilized, or otherwise had life made impossible for it by the United States. Not one socialist government or movement, he goes through a whole list of them, not one has been permitted to rise or fall solely on its own merits. Not one was left secure enough to drop its guard against the all-powerful enemy abroad and freely and fully relax control at home. It's as if the Wright brothers' first experiments with flying machines all failed because the automobile interests sabotaged each flight test. And then the good God-fearing folk of the world looked upon this, took notice of the consequences, nodded their collective heads wisely, and intoned solemnly, "Man shall never fly." Right? So Bloom is taking a position on this that I don't 100% agree with in certain regards, because I do think it's also important to note that even though it's been siege socialism, socialism has succeeded in flying in quite remarkable ways. But the importance of this quote is that it highlights the fact that socialism is a project that and a process, as we were saying earlier with the discussion of dialectics, that emerges within a capitalist world system, and that it has been under siege at every possible level. That siege has been military, of course, a military siege with the 14 capitalist countries invading the Soviet Union between 1918 and 1920 in order to strangle the red babe in its crib, as Winston Churchill said. But it's also economic, like the blockade that was orchestrated around the Soviet Union and every other socialist country. It's technological, it's cultural, it's intellectual, and it consists in mobilizing all of the dirty tricks possible in order to crush or pervert socialist countries.
A quote from Bloom, I actually had that ready to read.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
Yeah. So that's good.
We're on the same page, quite literally.
Siege socialism, the phrase itself, as you mentioned, coined by Parenti. You know this as well, but for our listeners' sake, I believe, from what I understand, this is a very amateur word study that I did, but the term itself is kind of based on the concept of capitalist encirclement, which was a phrase used by the Bolsheviks, Stalin, perhaps Lenin, I'm not too sure about that, but it was used by the Soviets, particularly in the 30s, as the Nazi Party was ramping up in Germany. And this concept of capitalist encirclement was viewed as the primary, I guess, threat to the Soviet Union outside of Trotskyism, which was identified in the 30s. And perhaps we'll get to that later. And the Soviet Union held this, actually, the party held this as one of its kind of core propaganda points up until the late 1950s, when Khrushchev actually, where he essentially went against this idea and suggested that capitalist countries are now being encircled by socialism. And I'm not too sure how accurate that historical or assessment is, but that's how the party saw it. So siege socialism kind of grows out of this very long-standing idea and tradition and understanding of how capitalist countries were impacting the Soviet Union. Certainly the early Bolsheviks, Lenin, even Trotsky, Stalin, in the 20s, as the revolution was ongoing, as they're entering the Civil War, they were going into this war, kind of hoping that another country would turn to socialism that was going to do so on a better footing, such as Germany and other countries as well. Not having those allies, an ally that was more developed, that had a more advanced version of capitalism to build socialism from, this threat of capitalist encirclement was even a larger threat than they had anticipated. Essentially, the point I want to make. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead if you want to give examples or kind of add on to what I said. Yeah,
because I think that the capitalist encirclement needs to be kind of fully understood. And I admit myself in my early studies of socialism, I didn't grasp the extent to which the imperialist war on socialism is an all-out war that is unrelenting and at every possible level. And I've learned this in part through the history of my studies of the U.S. national security state and all of the dirty tricks that they engaged with. So one of the examples, just to flesh it out a little bit, that I was thinking of sharing is that Ernesto Che Guevara said regarding the Cuban Revolution, he was asked in an interview, this was after 1959 and the successful seizure of power, said, well, the question was, what are the main problems facing the Cuban Revolution? And Che famously said, well, there are two of them, imperialism and imperialism. And of course, the joke is that that is the quintessential problem facing all socialist state building projects. And what he had in mind was all of the things that the United States were doing against this small island. They were running terror campaigns that consisted in bombing attacks, firebomb air raids, terrorist campaigns that also then included forms of economic warfare, the draconian and, of course, illegal blockade, the extensive use of biological weapons and forms of chemical weaponry as well that was deployed, anti-crop warfare, warfare against livestock in order to try to just kill the food supply, the endless assassination attempts against the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, incessant and extremely well-funded propaganda campaigns, sprawling networks of spies and State Department operatives engaged in the dirtiest of dirty tricks, all of the destabilization campaigns. We have the Bay of Pigs invasion, of course, in the case of Cuba, but it goes on and on and on. And it's very important, I think, for everyone to study and understand the extent to which socialism has had to emerge within these conditions, both to understand what it means to fight and win and to develop the necessary defenses in that struggle, but also in order to then understand the differences between what socialism looks like when you think about it when you're reading a book or sitting in an armchair versus when you're actually building a state. And in the case of the US government, we know in the case, William Bloom cites these numbers, but they'd have to be extended to today. Only since World War II, the US has endeavored to overthrow 50 foreign governments, the majority of which are democratically elected. And so siege socialism, I think, is a historical materialist term that really allows us to grasp the specificity of the context within which socialism in the real world emerges and has only existed up to this point in time. And of course, we might get to this later, but the case of China in the 21st century is extremely important because of the ongoing war on China that is a hybrid war, right? That takes many, many different forms and is attempting to stop the rise of the Red Dragon unsuccessfully.
One thing that I've heard in response to people talking about the conditions in which socialism emerges is that capitalist countries face the same threats or crises, which I would argue, I'm sure you would argue, is nowhere near the same. Like, say, for example, when it comes to the capitalists in any other country, say, for example, with the USA here, we have Germany here, regardless of who was in power, whether the capitalists would still be there regardless of the ideology, whether it's the Nazis or whether it's liberalism or whether it's fascism or whether it's however you want to put it. This capitalist structure is still maintained throughout the whole thing, regardless of whatever subversion is happening. Democratically elected capitalist leader is just going to be deposed and replaced by another one, rather than socialist countries, which are prevented from even having a system that's being able to be maintained regardless of whoever's attacking it.
It does make me think of one other absolutely essential aspect of siege socialism, and that is that socialism as it's developed in the real world as state building projects has only existed across the tricontinent, or what people call the global south or the third world, right? So socialism in the real world has emerged within the colonial and semi-colonial periphery of capitalism. Capitalism did that to people, meaning that capitalism emerged into this world through the bloody colonial conquest and everything that implied. And in that regard, I think we also have to situate siege socialism within this deeper reality, and that is that capitalism underdeveloped the third world in order to develop the first world. And so it's not only that the socialist state building projects are under siege directly by the most developed countries in the world, the imperialist countries, but it's also that they inherit decades, usually centuries, of structural underdevelopment of their countries. And on top of that, they do not rely on colonialism in order to build up the productive forces like the capitalists did and do. And so in comparing the emergence of capitalism driven by colonialism to the emergence of socialism, which is the anti-colonial project par excellence, we're really comparing apples and oranges and confusing ourselves historically at a very profound level.
No, certainly. And I think that even kind of speaks to the concepts that you explained at the start there in regards to historical materialism and even looking at history through this dialectical perspective, as opposed to, kind of flattening this concept of countries emerging or the state building project, as you mentioned, and realizing that they're starting at totally different points. As you mentioned, colonialism on one end and anti-colonialism on the other. And that is a dialectical, from what I understand, conflict there between the two.
Absolutely. And you see it clearly, the power of a dialectical analysis, because you always have to see any specific occurrence in relationship to the totality. And so all of the socialist state building projects are situated within the broader imperialist world. And it's precisely in situating them in those relationships that we can flesh out their material reality and also recognize that Marxism and historical materialism, more specifically, I said at the kind of end of my statement about it, that it mobilizes the agency of people in order to become be able to make history and not simply be the subjects of history. But it is particularly important in framing this kind of imperialist history of what socialism has done in relationship to struggling against imperialism, because it maximizes the agency of those involved and allows us to recognize that Marxism has fundamentally been in the long 20th century, but also in the 19th and the 21st, so the expansive 20th century, has been an anti-colonial science of liberation. That's been its quintessential and fundamental contribution to humanity, and not only to humanity, to planet Earth, for also trying to, as much as possible, put a halt to the forms of ecological degradation that don't only crush the so-called subhumans of this world, but also crush other life forms and the biosphere.
So I realized that I kind of jumped the gun here, but that's totally fine, because we're talking about the next question, which was, how does understanding dialectics and historical materialism play, or how does it figure into analyzing and understanding 20th century siege socialism? So we've kind of briefly addressed that. Did you have any other comments?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's really important, and this is also in relationship to my criticisms of the Western left, to understand that socialism isn't a fixed paradigm of a future society. Socialism is quite literally the contradictory process of developing towards a more egalitarian society called communism from capitalism. Contradiction is baked into the socialist process. And that also means that if we have a dialectical apprehension of socialism, we approach it as situated within the capitalist world system, characterized by imperialism, as I was saying a moment ago, and that once we materially situate socialism in that context, then we understand why there's a kind of categorical imperative of all socialist state building projects, which is develop or die. You have to develop the productive forces, given everything we were just saying about siege socialism. You have to develop them. You have to do it quickly. You start with a hind start because your country's been underdeveloped by the history of imperialism. You can't rely on colonialism, right? So all the things that we were just saying, and you're constantly subjected to imperialist aggression and anti-communist propaganda, right? So you have to develop self-defense and cultural autonomy. You have to educate your citizenry. And all of this means that in this particular context, I think that there's a logic that is important to understand, and that is the relationship between tactics and strategy, right? Tactics would be the kind of short-term maneuvers necessary to advance towards a strategy, which is the long-term overall objective. And if you have to develop the productive forces as quickly as possible, otherwise you're going to be crushed. And not just crushed, like you might have your people genocidally eliminated. Right? There's the famous quote from Stalin where he said something like, we're 50 or 100 years behind the developed countries. He knew the Nazis were going to invade. And he said, we have to make up that difference in 10 years. And if we don't, we'll be crushed. Right? So he meant that literally. And it was a literal historical fact. And they did it, which is quite amazing. So those are the circumstances. But what that allows us, I think, to see and is important to apprehend is that the tactics that are used to develop the productive forces can sometimes appear to contradict the strategy or the overall goal. right? You can't just have a socialist state and immediately have it be 100% quote unquote democratic in the kind of bourgeois terms that are operative under capitalism. You can't simply decentralize everything immediately. You can't get rid of work. You can't get rid of money. All of these kind of utopian ideas about socialism have very little to do about building it in the real world and a lot more to do with fixed idealist ideas about what it should be. And so those tactics that socialist state building projects have had to use sometimes do appear to be on a slightly different path. And I think we're going to unpack this a little bit more with opening up to capitalist investment, with intensifying forms of exploitation of certain workers in order to develop the productive forces so that they don't all get killed. Doing that means that we have to understand socialism as a contradictory process, while at the same time recognizing that if the socialist state building project remains on course, those contradictions are going to be ironed out over time. And the quicker you can iron them out, the faster you can get to a higher level of development that will allow you to overcome a lot of those problems much more quickly and much more capaciously, right? So there's a kind of sacrifice that goes into the actual process of building socialist states. And this leads to, and I think this is where we're headed, socialist states, at least from the perspective of the Western left, sometimes are perceived as having withdrawn from their goals or gone on detours or things like this.
I mean, there's an irony, of course, that Western leftists may not fully understand this reality because it appears that capitalists do, they understand that their machinations, their subversion attempts, etc., will lead to these things, and there's a benefit not only propaganda-wise but in other ways to delegitimize this process as it's occurring. I'm going to quote here quickly from, and I'm sure you've heard this before, this is a 1953 CIA document regarding the death of Stalin and what's going to happen next in the Soviet Union. So I'm going to quickly read from that. So it says, this is the CIA, this is one of their internal memos. It says, even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. The Western idea of a dictator within the communist setup is exaggerated. Misunderstandings on the subject are caused by lack of comprehension of the real nature and organization of the communist power structure. Stalin, although holding wide powers, is merely the captain of a team, and it seems obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. However, it does not appear that any of the present leaders will rise to the stature of Lenin and Stalin, so that it will be safer to assume that the development in Moscow will be along the lines of what is called collective leadership. Unless Western policies, and here's the key point I want to get here, it ends with saying, unless the Western policies force the Soviets to streamline their power organization. So essentially they're aware that the more pressure they put on the system, it's going to move away from a collective leadership in that sense. So yeah, I wanted to make that point.
Well, yeah, I think it's an important point because the Central Intelligence Agency, like other agencies within the U.S. national security state, they are tasked with doing something quite unique. I mean, they do a number of things, but as Ralph McGehee said, their fundamental purpose is disinformation. Or as William Casey, the CIA director, who was, I believe, inaugurated in 81 at the early 80s, he said, we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false, right? So the American public all thinks that Stalin's a dictator. But the Central Intelligence Agency and these other agencies, they actually have to know the truth of what's going on, or they have to try to access the truth of what's going on because they're agents in the real material world. And if they act in the world according to their mythological constructs, their actions are not going to work out very well. And so the basis of their disinformation is trying to actually understand the real information or get correct information about how the world operates. So I think that's just a really important point that you highlighted, but these ideas have really filtered into a lot of the Western left, right? Because then the Western left just takes these propaganda lines because they're the propaganda lines that are published in not only the liberal platforms, but also in the Western Marxist platforms, if it be, Jacobin or Democracy Now! Or other platforms like that are kind of rad lib or Marx adjacent in various ways, or might even self-describe as Marxist, but ultimately are not, and in the true anti-colonial, anti-imperialist sense of that term.
So what are some prominent examples of these detours or retreats from socialism during the 20th century? And maybe I should kind of rephrase that because you've clarified for us that these aren't necessarily moving away from socialism because it's part of the process of building towards socialism, but at least on the level of, how it's perceived, by the wider group of people viewing the scenario unfolding?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways of understanding this, and it's an example that I used in an article that I'm working on, is when Lenin described the process of building socialism in terms of mountain climbing. And he used this metaphor. He said that, there's this mountain climber is trying to get to the top of a summit that's never been scaled before. And there's a bunch of onlookers down below, and they see that he turns back from the path. And many of them then start heckling and saying, he should have waited until our perfect idea of how to scale the mountain was sorted out and all these things. So he's kind of describing the utopian socialists, and for that matter, also the conservatives who said, we should have never tried to climb the mountain in the first place because it's impossible. What Lenin elucidates is to climb a summit that's never been ascended before, sometimes you have to go back down in order to find an alternative path. It's a perfect description of how tactics relate to strategy. If the strategy is to get to the end and you just pursue your tactic towards the end and you end up falling off the mountain, you're not a very good mountain climber. But backtracking or taking certain detours in order to find the way to ascent is the best way of doing it, because ultimately it's the primacy of practice, right? There's not a Bible that's going to tell us how to make the world socialist. There's an ongoing practical process of trying to understand the world, implement certain practices, and then seeing what works and what doesn't. And some famous examples of backtracking. In fact, Lenin, when he wrote this metaphor, it was in the wake of the new economic policy, and that's what he was alluding to, right? When he introduced the new economic policy, which basically allowed for certain capitalist investment in the Soviet Union, there were Bolsheviks who tore up their party cards and said, look, this isn't what I signed up for. This is supposed to be anti-capitalist. Why is it that Lenin is letting capitalist investment happen? And they took a kind of purist line, which is very widespread within this kind of Western left orientation. And Lenin was trying to explain to people that if you're going to develop the productive forces, then you need capitalist investment in order to do that. And where's that capitalist investment going to come from in a country that's been underdeveloped by the history of colonialism and has been ransacked by war and imperialist invasion? Well, it's going to come from capitalists. And that did not mean that Lenin was abandoning the strategy of socialism. It meant that he was a brilliant tactician and knew that he needed capitalist investment in order to develop the productive forces so that they could eventually get to a higher level of development in which they would shift and pivot away from that, which is precisely what they did. Another really famous example, of course, is contemporary China, because when Mao died in 1976, and then there was the process of reform and opening up, many Western Marxists claim, not only many, it was more or less the consensus within the Western Marxist tradition, was that China had gone capitalist. The capitalist rotors had taken over and it had gone authoritarian capitalist. And I think the real rejoinder to this is there's a famous statement that Engels made in some of his late letters. There's one, I believe it's in 1890, when he was writing to Conrad Schmidt. He said, what all these gentlemen, and I'd say all these gentlemen and all these ladies in the kind of Western left, what they all lack is dialectics. Meaning what the Western left didn't understand is the dialectical process of developing socialism in a capitalist-dominated world in which the Soviet Union, as you've alluded to, was the kind of big brother that China was developing in the shadow of. And it watched and learned very important lessons from what was going on in the Soviet Union, studied it very, very closely. And among those lessons, it saw that, the Khrushchev revisionism and throwing Stalin under the bus was very detrimental at both an ideological and political and economic level. And so we shouldn't go in that particular direction. But also that the greatest difficulty that the Soviet Union had was particularly in the 1970s with a stagnating economy, which was largely due to the fact that the industrial base of the economy had developed so magnificently in the years between 1917 and the 1970s, with, of course, moments of setback, mainly the Nazi invasion, and that they had trouble making the qualitative leap to the next level at the same time when the West was introducing new forms of technology that were allowing it to make a qualitative leap. And so the reform and opening up that really kind of took on power under Deng was interpreted again as being, sacrificing the socialist project. And if listeners are curious about sources on this front, there's a lot of great work. I know you had Carlos Martinez on, who's fantastic on so many levels. One of the people who really convinced me of the line that I'm taking on China and that I'll outline in a little more detail in a moment is Domenico Losurdo and his book, Class Struggle. If you have some questions about the reform and opening up and whether or not contemporary China is on a socialist path, I would strongly recommend reading Class Struggle by Domenico Losurdo, because one of the things that I think he demonstrates quite convincingly is that what Deng was interested in is the technology transfer and the scientific transfer from the developed economies, both in Asia, Japan, South Korea, but then also from the West. And in order to get that, they needed to go through the reform and opening up, but they did it in a process that was very gradual and oriented towards the primacy of practice. So testing it out in particular cities, particular regions, seeing how it worked, seeing what the advances were, seeing how they could tweak it, and making sure that the Communist Party kept control of the towering pillars of the economy, the banking sector, as well as of the state, right? So that it wasn't just about letting capitalism in and allowing it to take over entirely. No, not by any stretch of the imagination. But what Deng was interested in, and this is Losurdo's line, he said that Deng liberated Marxism-Leninism from populist and pauperizing tendencies in order to develop socialism as the project of eliminating misery and fostering common prosperity. Because from Deng's perspective, socialism needed to develop the productive forces to such an extent that it was not only making ideological arguments saying that socialism was better because of all of the reasons that most of us probably know that socialism is better, but it needed to do that ideological work at the level of the economic base by materially demonstrating to people that the economy could be developed in such a way that it would surpass imperialist forms of development without relying on colonialism, which is an incredible, incredible task. Of course, what we see now, and I think that some people on the Western left, I think that David Harvey is one of them, and some others have now shifted a little bit on their position related to China. I know Vijay Prashad has quite some time ago, but nonetheless. And I think that that's a very important shift, and we should encourage that because we all make errors. I mean, I wasn't brought into this world thinking that China was socialist. I had to learn that. And the most important thing is you learn from your errors as quickly as possible, and you adjust for it. And I think that contemporary China clearly demonstrates that it is still on a socialist path with Chinese characteristics of a very particular sort. There's still ongoing class struggle within China and within the communist leadership, of course. But there are incredible gains that have been made with the history of the Chinese Revolution. I'll just point to one, which is the incredible poverty alleviation campaign of 850 million people. This surpasses the entire population of Latin America, which is at around 720 million people. Could you imagine one country in the world eliminating all extreme poverty for an entire continent? Because that's the equivalent in, per capita terms, is an awesome, awesome feat. The greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity. And there's lots of other things I could point to, or we could unpack if you want, but just in the interest of time, I'll allude to that, as well as the environmental civilization and the project of developing an environmental civilization and actually deciding very explicitly under Xi to cool down the economy in order to further develop the environmental or ecological civilization. So these are two signs, but there are many others that China is clearly on a socialist path, but they've been using tactics that they learned from the mistakes made, the failures made within the history of the socialist project within the Soviet Union and the larger Soviet sphere of influence. And in a certain sense, I think it's also, at least that's my understanding of it now, is that they saw the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West. It was so brutal and, led to an incredible arms race, and it was just constantly subjected to destabilization. China wanted to use a different way of kind of using the force of their adversaries against themselves. And in opening up, started to play part of the capitalist game, but playing the long game to figure out how to develop their economy so that they could surpass them. And now the productive base of the US economy no longer exists except for in the arms industry and the culture industry, some of the pharmaceutical industry, if you want to call that a productive sector. And, but China has a very vibrant, productive foundation for its economy. And so, according to many analysts, China's already won that long-term war in certain fundamental ways. Now, a lot yet remains to be seen because of the US reliance on military and other things like that. But I think that the reform and opening up is an excellent example of using a tactic in the service of a long-term strategy.
I think that was an excellent example and explanation. I'm going to try and provide one here myself, but this is not of something contemporary, but of the past. The Berlin Wall that was in East Germany. Of course, it's quite an iconic and controversial aspect of East Germany's history. Prior to its installation in 1961, essentially, for listeners, I'm sure most listeners know this at this point because you listen to the show, but Berlin was a city that was virtually, essentially in the middle of East Germany. East Germany controlled half of it, and West Germany controlled the other half. And so this posed two huge problems for East Germany's early development, or in the 40s and into the 50s, because on one hand, you had essentially a city-sized spy base in the middle of the country, which many subversion attempts were planned from. Most people who were spies in East Germany were recruited in West Germany, in West Berlin, because they could literally just walk over the line or go through the checkpoint to be with their handler, to provide information, etc. West Berlin also allowed for the opportunity for people to emigrate from East Germany into West Berlin, and through West Berlin go to West Germany. Saw, I think, roughly 3 million people leave the country in the 50s as the result of this kind of loose border that existed. And this meant that many professionals were lured to West Germany due to West Germany's support that they had from the US, which is just pumping money and opportunity through the Marshall Plan and other things to really build up West Germany. So, I understand why people would take up the opportunity to do so, given East Germany's relative, lack of productive capacities or opportunities, etc. And so something had to be done. They waited for a very long time. I think the early 52, was when they first proposed building a wall to divide the two Germanys. But they kind of waited. I think the Soviet Union kind of put that idea down because they didn't want to start a military conflict, which is, again, understandable. But eventually, they saw that it was necessary to build the wall, even though not only from an optics point of view, but even from the perspective of trying to build this egalitarian society, building a wall that was enforced militarily between essentially two groups of people who are the same. They're the same society, the same people, could be seen as a retreat or as a detour from building socialism. But what resulted from that is East Germany became significantly more stabilized and was able to build those productive capacities that you mentioned once the wall was in place. And the period in the 60s and the 70s is known as the most stable period during the building of what eventually becomes the most advanced socialist country in the 20th, or some would argue is the most advanced socialist country in the 20th century. So I just want to use that example as even potentially more controversial than China, at least from a Western point of view.
I think it's such a great example because it also touches on the concept, or one of the concepts that's often used to denigrate actually existing socialist states, and that is authoritarianism, right? What's more authoritarian than building a wall and not allowing people to go through unless you decide to allow them to? But authoritarianism is a really misused concept because it's not about just exercising authority. It's about developing sovereignty in an imperialist world. And so one of the reasons for the founding of the establishment of the Berlin Wall, you alluded to the spies and all of that, the terror campaigns and the sabotage campaigns that they were running against East Germany. You really have to read accounts of them because, and I'm sure you have, they're unbelievably brutal, right? Constantly blowing up bridges and railways and causing problems with livestock and doing forms of arson and anything they could, basically, to wreak havoc. Just like the list that I gave earlier regarding Cuba. And so is it authoritarianism or is it an attempt to exercise sovereignty and keep the imperialist destabilizers out? And you can ask yourself the same question about, all of the criticisms of China for its internet policies and not wanting basically CIA contracting big tech to be operative in their country. Just think about it for 2 seconds, right? Google, Amazon, all of these platforms, they all are in bed with the US national security state. And this has been documented in great detail. The Chinese know this. Why would they let them in? No, they want a great firewall, right? This isn't authoritarianism. It's exercising sovereignty. And they should have the democratic right to exercise sovereignty.
Now, that's a great point. And I'll kind of wrap up this point here. The book that you were reading, a quote from earlier, Killing Hope by William Blum, has a great listing of all these things you're talking about that occurred in East Germany. I also recommend people check out the recent episode on the other podcast I host called Proles Pod, the podcast formerly known as PRS The Round Table. In that episode, it's called The Subversion of East Germany. I walk through some of those things that you mentioned using William Blum's list and other kind of specific examples of what was going on. And one thing that I pointed out during that episode is that there's no parallel to this security or sovereignty situation of having, a hostile country sharing your capital city with you. It's just there's no parallel, and so they had to, as you mentioned, like they had to. There's a difference between tactic and strategy, and
maybe Guantanamo Bay would be the U.S. equivalent, right? Except for that the Cubans aren't running destabilization campaigns against them. The Cubans have, asked for their land back and basically allowed them to have one of their many prison sites, international prison sites. Anyway, it's not a perfect analogy.
No, certainly that's a good point. I hadn't thought of Guantanamo Bay, but yeah, I'll have to think about that some more. So getting on to our next question here. So why is all this stuff that we've talked about so hard for the Western left to understand and process? The fact that these retreats or detours, that it's logical and dialectical to pursue.
Well, I think the fundamental reason is the very extensive propaganda that's run and that has convinced people of a lot of the false ideas that we've touched on. But without going into the kind of deep history of propaganda and all of its effects, I think that if we only stay at the level of the analysis that we were talking about with a dialectical approach, one thing that Mao used to distinguish between kind of different levels of apprehension, if you will, and he borrowed this from Hegel, the early 19th century German philosopher, is that at the lowest level of apprehension, it is sense perception. It's just seeing something, hearing something, and then processing what it is. And I feel like a lot of the Western left really remains at this level. So I have this idea of what socialism is supposed to be like. Everybody's equal. There's no racism. There's no misogyny. The society's more developed. Everybody's free, etc. And then with my sense perception, I look at Cuba or China or a country like this, and I think, well, it doesn't match the idea that I have in my mind. And this is a very low cognitive level, if you will. It's very underdeveloped. And I think it's important that we point out the extent to which it's underdeveloped. It's like looking at the world like someone who's uneducated and doesn't have a conceptual apparatus to understand what it is that they're seeing. And so the higher levels of consciousness that Mao pointed out were kind of logical understanding is a much higher level. And logical understanding relates to an apprehension that we were just talking about, right? When you look at a country like East Germany and the Berlin Wall, and you situate it from a historical materialist vantage point in the history of imperialism and destabilization efforts, and then you look at the wall and you think, oh no, the wall isn't there as this authoritarian policing mechanism that is bad for its people because it's totalitarian. It's actually trying to keep out the imperialists so that they can develop their country, and also, of course, limit some of the brain drain that goes on and the pilfering of the petty bourgeois class sector. That is the class sector that's usually mobilized and historically was mobilized to overthrow those countries, right, in the Eastern Bloc. And so there's a lot that goes in there, but if you have a level of logical understanding, then you can see the dialectics of socialism. And actually, that's an incorrect term. You don't see the dialectics of socialism, right? What you see at the level of sense perception is just what you see is kind of what you get. And that's how the Western left tends to operate. If you understand, though, you can apprehend the dialectics of socialism and recognize that sometimes you're going to see things that don't look like the strategy of socialism that you're headed towards, because there are tactics that might appear quote unquote authoritarian or quote unquote anti-democratic or things like this, but you have to understand them as part of a larger process. And the highest level for Mao is praxis, right? So the Eastern Marxists, as they've been referred to historically, are those who actually implemented Marxism and made it a real world project. And so it's not just about understanding the dialectics of socialism, it's about implementing them and then seeing what works and what doesn't work, right? And learning from that process. And this takes us back to our discussion of China, right? One of the reasons that China doesn't look like the Soviet Union did in, I don't know, the 1930s is because it learned a lot from what was going on in the Soviet Union, and it's adapted through an analysis of its own conjuncture and from an analysis of practice and what works and what doesn't work. And so in that regard, I think that the Western left really has to get more sophisticated, more reflexive, and develop a more dialectical understanding of what it means to develop socialism, not just as an idea, not as a blueprint, but as a reality in this world, which is the world of imperialist underdevelopment. And that requires understanding this kind of contradictory relationship between tactics and strategies. And maybe the last thing that I would say to make sure that nobody misunderstands me on this front, it doesn't mean that you can't have criticisms and that there aren't important criticisms within the socialist tradition. In fact, I would say it's the lifeblood of that tradition. Unlike the capitalists and the fascists, there's a tradition of self-critique. It's what makes us stronger. But that self-critique has to be based on an analysis of the social totality and testing out in practice and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and then adjusting accordingly. And there are projects that have waved the banner of socialism in some way that clearly didn't have the strategy in mind that we're headed towards. I mean, even National Socialism, for that matter, was waving a certain very distorted banner of socialism. So we need to keep our kind of critical impulse, but situate the analysis within this kind of broader spectrum of the social totality that we've been talking about.
And even that, pointing out that self-critique as being, part of the socialist tradition, a very key aspect of it. Another irony is that these detours or retreats down from the mountain to find a different path is an example of that self-critique, right? That comes about by analyzing the situation and determining that it's best that we go this way instead of that way.
Exactly.
And if that other way doesn't work, then you figure out a different way to get to the point that you want to go. So,
and one of the key aspects of ultra-leftism that's criticized by Marxists is this idea that, well, you'll get to the summit, whatever the cost, and I'm sure I see this in the activist world in Philadelphia, mainly driven by a kind of anarchist ultra-leftism where there's a major mobilization and then immediately somebody's lighting a cop car on fire, breaking a bunch of windows and really just we're gonna fucking make the revolution today. Mm-hmm. And that's it. That ultra-leftism is very, very misguided because it doesn't recognize that you can't just run your way to the top. You've got to find out tactics or discover tactics that actually work and that is based in a mass movement, right? Not a few adventurous who are running out in front because they're the purists and they're the ones who are going to do it the right way, etc. And I do think that kind of ultra-leftism and adventurism is unfortunately somewhat widespread in certain sectors of the Western left.
No, thanks for that, Gabriel. At this point, I think we'll end this part of the episode. So, Gabriel, thank you so much for walking us through these concepts. I remember doing philosophy 101 in university over a decade ago, and I feel like I've learned more about philosophy and understanding the social totality, as you call it, in this hour than I ever did in those courses. So, thank you again for joining the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure. Keep up the great work. I think that the information war is one of the most important ones. So I encourage you to keep doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.